units of area. So when we're talking about area, we're talking about the amount of space taken up by a two-dimensional shape. So this square here is taking up that much space. We measure it in square units. That is, this is taking up a space of 1 millimeter squared. Oh, I'll get a pen that actually shows you a colour there. 1 millimeter squared. Because it's 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter, it's taking up a square space of 1 millimeter on each side. This is taking up a space of 1 centimeter squared, and if I'd drawn this big enough as a meter by a meter, this would be 1 meter squared. So when I say squared here, I'm saying this is one square shape that's a meter by a meter. So when I'm saying a shape is 3 square centimeters or 3 centimeters squared, I'm saying it takes up 3 of those. But it won't always be a square shape. So this is 1 centimeter squared, and these are a whole bunch of different shapes where the area is 1 centimeter squared. Now it's really obvious for this one, because that's a square and that's 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, and it's taking up 1 centimeter squared. And actually it's 4 of these little grid squares, because I've got little half centimeter ones here. And we can see that really nicely for this. That's taking up 4 of those little grid squares, so I know that's 1 centimeter squared. But almost all of the rest are taking up part squares. You can see they're all roughly the same size, and in fact they're all exactly the same size. 1 square, 2 squares, square and a bit, square and a bit. So you can see it's taking up the same amount of space, but we can't just count squares. So it's this much space, but it won't always be that shape. Now we start by talking about units of area. So these are some really obvious ones. Millimeter squared means the amount of space in a square. It's 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter. A centimeter squared, that much space. A meter squared, well, it'd be really big, but pretend that's a meter. And what units we use depends on the side length that they give us in the question. So when we do some questions later, if they give me centimetres as my side length, I'm going to find the answer in centimetres squared. If they give me metres, I'll find the answer in metres squared. But sometimes we will have to convert between the different areas. And it's not as simple as length conversion, it's a little bit different. A really good way of thinking about this is, let's find this area in millimetres squared. Now 1 centimetre is 10 millimetres. So that's 10 millimetres, if I split this up into 10 millimetres there, and it's 10 millimetres this way, so if I split it up into 10 millimetres here, that's 10 lots of 10, that's 100. 1 centimetre squared equals 100 millimetres squared. Now if you remember, for length conversions, 1 centimetre equals 10 millimetres. So it's not the same conversion for area. And the little cheat is that you take the length conversion and you square it, because the length here is 10 lots of 1, or 10 times, but I've got to multiply it by itself to get the area. That's 10 times 10. So this is actually 10 squared in square millimetres. So that's how we get that 100. So you can use the length to remind yourself a centimetre squared is 100 millimetres squared. Or you can just draw a little 1 centimetre squared and divide it up into millimetres and go, hey, 10 times 10 is 100. Now for a metre squared, what might that be in centimetres squared? 1 metre is 100 centimetres, and that would mean splitting this up, I'm not going to do it, 100 times that way, pretend that's 100, and it's 100 centimetres this way, And people who are feeling very clever about area will know that we just need to multiply these two to get the area. 100 times 100, a metre squared is 10,000 centimetres squared, because it's 100 times 100 is 10,000. And it's the same little trick. It's 100 squared centimetres squared. So you can always get that 10,000 conversion by saying, I know that 1 metre is 100 centimetres, but because I'm making a square of it, it's 100 squared. 100 times 100 is 10,000. Now a hectare is actually the amount of space that's made by a square that's 100 metres on each side. So 100 times 100, that's 10,000 metres squared is a hectare, which we often hear used to talk about large areas of land. So for example, 10,000 square metres is quite big. Someone who's got quite a big block of land in the suburbs might have 1,000 metres squared. A small block in the suburbs might be 500 metres squared. A really big block in the suburbs might possibly be 1,500 metres. So this is a lot bigger. This is the sort of thing you get out in Murrum Bateman and Yass and stuff like that. And a kilometre squared is ridiculously huge. That's the amount of space taken up by a kilometre, by 1 kilometre, and of course that's 1,000 metres by 1,000 metres. So that would be 1 million, 1,000 times 1,000 metres squared. And the same trick works for this one, because that was 1,000 squared metres squared. So from the length conversion, we can work out the area conversion. Now there's one of these little things in your book, these little diagrams that let you just get the cheaty conversion. And you can use that if you want. So it's on, I'll just find the page and mention it to you. Page 192. So if, for example, you had your book available to you, there's always this little diagram, and it says if I'm going from kilometres squared to metres squared, you're going to multiply by, the relationship is 1 million, metres squared to centimetres squared, multiply by 10,000, centimetres squared to millimetres squared, multiply by 100. And going back the other way, same numbers, but if I was going from millimetres squared to centimetres squared, I'd divide by 100. So if you've got this in front of you, this is great to use if it's open book. But people find it hard to remember whether they should be multiplying or dividing. So I taught you a different method last time we had to do conversions. And you can use this one if you've got it in front of you, that's fine. We'll use it for one of the questions, but I'll teach you the rates method again instead. So completing these conversions. Let's do one with the little diagram. So it's page 192. Oh, just getting page there. So here we go. This question is going from metres squared to centimetres squared. Metres squared to centimetres squared times by 10,000. So you could just do 0.248 times 10,000, and you can use your calculator if you want, or you can use the bouncing decimal point method. So let's be careful. 0.248 times 10,000 That's 2,480 centimeters squared. So you can do it that way with that little diagram. If you don't have the diagram and you don't remember, the rates method is good. Millimeters squared to centimeters squared. So you work out how many millimeters squared in a centimeter squared. And if you need to draw it and draw the number of millimeters and times by 2, times it by itself, 10 times 10, then you can. But it's 10 squared, so 100 millimeters squared in a centimeter squared. So we write it down. 100 millimeters squared in 1 centimeter squared. So you write down the rate, and then you put the value that you know in the right spot. So we've got millimeters squared. We're going to put it in here. 3,100. And you can write equals or 2 or whatever. You've got to work out what we multiplied by here. Remember? If you can't work out what we multiplied by, your trick is divide back. So we'll divide back 3,100 divided by 100. That's times 31. Times 31. So this has to be times 31, and 1 times 31, 31 centimeters squared. So as long as you can get the conversion rate to start with, you can use rates to get your answer. 30 hectares to meters squared. Again, you've got to remember 10,000 meters squared in 1 hectare. So you'd probably have to look up that rule. Substitute in underneath the one that you do know. I know 30 hectares. This is easy to work out what the multiplication was. 1 times 30. So I've got to do this side times 30. And I'll get that's 30 times 10,000. Grab your calculator if you're not sure about the zeros. 30 times 10,000. 300,000 meters squared in 30 hectares. Now incidentally, that's the size of my place, so I've got 300,000, I forgot a 0. 300,000 meters squared. Okay, conversion of units, we've got to be able to do it, but you do have a couple of different methods.